Good evening, everybody. I am Walid Ziad, Assistant Professor and Dr. Ali Jarahi Fellow in Persian Studies at the Department of Religious Studies at UNC Chapel Hill. I'm so pleased to be with you today with an absolutely fascinating panel. As you know, today we are talking to our own Dr. Claudia Yaghoobi about her most recent book, Temporary Marriage in Iran, Gender and Body Politics in Modern Iranian Film and Literature, published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. Our moderator today is Dr. Maryam Zehtabi. Dr. Zehtabi is a lecturer of Middle Eastern and South Asian languages and cultures at the University of Virginia. She has a PhD in comparative literature and a graduate certificate in film studies from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Her recent research has focused on the ramifications of sex work in Iran from the constitutional revolution of the early 20th century to the present day through the lens of Persian literature and film. She's particularly interested in women, gender, and sexuality studies and the intersection of religion and feminism. Her current research centers around the issue of child marriage. Her works have appeared in the International Journal of Persian Literature, The Guardian, and the Journal of Middle East Women's Studies. Please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to post your questions. Dr. Zehtabi will address as many questions as possible. Before handing it over to Dr. Zehtabi, I would like to thank UNC Persian Studies, the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, and the Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies that have co-sponsored and made this event possible. Dr. Zehtabi, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Hello, everybody. Let me start by thanking the Persian Studies program at UNC Chapel Hill for inviting me here and putting these wonderful panels together for all those who are interested in learning about recent publications by Iranians in the diaspora. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Claudia Yaghoobi to you. If you have been following Dr. Yaghoobi's career as I have in the recent years, I'm sure you're also in awe of how much she has accomplished in the past decade alone. Claudia Yaghoobi is a Roshan Associate Professor and the inaugural Director of Persian Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She received her PhD in Comparative Literature from the University of California at Santa Barbara in 2013. She is the author of Temporary Marriage in Iran, Gender and Body Politics in Modern Iranian Literature and Film, published by Cambridge University Press in 2020, and Subjectivity in Attar, Persian, Sufism and European Mysticism, published by Purdue University Press in 2017. She's also the co-editor with Janet Afori of a book series titled Sex, Marriage, and Family in the Middle East for Bloomsbury Press. As an Iranian Armenian American, Yaghoobi's research concerns the literature of the Middle East with a special focus on Persian and Armenian literature. Within Persian literature and culture, her focus is on the members of sexual, ethnic, and religious minority populations, ones marginalized by normative society. Her work addresses the embodiments of liminality through which authors, artists, directors challenge and critique social hegemonies. Her first monograph, Subjectivity in Attar, Persian Sufism and European Mysticism, reassesses the significance of the concept of transgression and construction of subjectivity within select works of the medieval Persian Sufi poet Fariduddin Attar, who was a 12th century, 13th century poet. She traces the intersections of transgression, law, inclusion and exclusion, self and the other in Attar's treatment of class, gender, sexuality, and religion. Her second monograph, Temporary Marriage in Iran, Gender and Body Politics in Modern Persian Literature and Film, examines the representations of sigheh, or temporary marriage, in modern Iranian cultural productions. However, the book moves beyond the literary and cinematic realms and examines in depth a rather controversial social institution that has been the subject of disdain for many Iranian feminists and captured the imagination of many Western observers. Her third book project is tentatively titled Multiple Consciousness and Transnationalism in Iranian Armenian Cultural Productions. This project examines the various creative ways that Iranian Armenian authors and artists, as members of religious and cultural minority populations of Iran and later of the diaspora in the US, craft and negotiate a unique notion of self, which is at odds with a wish to be integrated into the mainstream society while maintaining ties with the homeland. The works she examines were produced mainly over the past 40 years as they respond to two main turning points that resulted in the mass migration of the people from Iran to the US, namely the Islamic Revolution and the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988. Join me, please, in welcoming Dr. Claudia Yaghoobi. Dr. Yaghoobi, hello, and welcome to our panel.
Thank you, Mariam. This is an honor to be introduced by my dear colleague and my former graduate student, Mariam Zehtabi, who's a professor herself at UVA today, and also to be introduced by my dear friend and colleague, Walid Ziad, in the Religious Studies Department. So today I'm going to talk about my book, Temporary Marriage in Iran, but because I know that the majority of the those of you who had registered were from the student body at UNC and beyond, I'm going to give a brief overview of what sigheh marriages or temporary marriages are and the historical evolution of sigheh marriage in Iran, as well as my own argument and the work that I've done in this book. So sigheh is a tradition that predates Islam in the Arabian Peninsula, which means that sigheh is a cultural institution rather than a religious one, which is popularly believed. It remains a legitimate function among the Iranian 12 Shiites. The second caliph, Omar, the second caliph of Sunnis, outlawed sigheh, but Shiites have chosen to view this as optional and non-binding. And even though it is banned in Sunni communities, some forms of sigheh marriages and the custom have survived in unions known as orfi or mesyar in Sunni communities as well. Now, ideologically, Shiite doctrines draw a line between sigheh marriages, that is temporary marriages, and nikah marriages, which are the formal marriages. Sigheh marriages are specific in their duration. That is, the couple, upon agreeing to enter a sigheh contract, also agree on the duration of their union. And this can be between an hour to 99 years, and it can always be renewed. Sigheh marriages do not have dowry, or the amount of dowry is lower than the formal marriages. There is also no alimony or nafaqeh in sigheh marriages. And of course, there is no formal divorce because, as I mentioned, the duration that they agree upon, when they come to the end of that time period, the union ends, and with a settlement, the financial exchange that they have agreed upon, which is also called ajr, the union ends. In sigheh marriages, the woman also has to keep a dab, which is a period of abstinence for 2 menstrual cycles or 45 days, while this is 3 menstrual cycles in nikah marriages. And this is for making sure about paternity if there is pregnancy and a child involved. Now, in sigheh marriages, there is no inheritance for women. However, if there is a child out of sigheh marriages, there will be inheritance only if the husband, that is the father, accepts the paternity of the child. Now, historically in Iran, during the Qajar era, which is between 1789 to 1925, sigheh marriages were used as tools for various political purposes. For instance, one way that it was used and viewed was as a measure to avoid gender segregation, as opposed to being a mere sexual outlet. Although pleasure and gratification in a legal context were still used as a reason for sigheh marriages, and men might still bring their sigheh wives home as maids for their formal wives, other times these sexual liaisons would only last for a couple of hours. It became apparent during the Qajar era that sigheh marriages were also heavily class-based. That is, women from the lower strata of the society, for example, who worked for bazaris, provided the bazaris with an income source through sigheh marriages. And then the same bazaris, that is, these businessmen, only approved of sigheh marriages for their own daughters only if the man involved was of a higher social status, but they would contract very easily out their employees who relied on them financially to anyone. So sigheh was also at this time period a good source of income for clerics who approached divorced and widowed women and made arrangements for them to become sigheh wives for men who were on pilgrimage. During the Pahlavi era, in 1925 to 1979, beginning with Reza Shah, his regime prioritized a major health campaign as state policy. At this time, sigheh, like sex work, was viewed popularly as the reason for the spread of venereal diseases in medical and legal circles, even though the clerics denied any links between sigheh and venereal diseases and opposed any measures taken by the state that would curtail male sexual privilege. Now, clerics argued that men who contracted sigheh marriages would never visit sex workers and therefore would not spread venereal diseases. Reza Shah's government was only focused on traditional marital hygiene, population control, and sex work, and it did not really address concerns about sigheh and, of course, the spread of venereal diseases in this kind of marriages. Even the Marriage Act of 1931, which required pre-marriage health certificates from men, did not curb the infection rates, and it still permitted polygamy, even though it required the registration of sigheh marriages. During the Mohammad Reza Shah's time period and reign, despite all the dramatic reforms that we have in terms of gender and sexuality, these reforms mostly affected women in urban middle-class communities, while the institution of marriage remained much the same in poor, rural, and urban communities. And although monogamy was still the norm in the migrant and rural communities, sigheh still existed because it functioned again as a source of income, as well as sexual outlet for clerics and bazaris. Under the Islamic Republic, first on Ayatollah Khomeini's agenda was to purify Tehran's red light district, whose female inhabitants were arrested, imprisoned, and sent to rehabilitation centers where they were forced to contract sigheh with Revolutionary Guards or war veterans from Iran-Iraq War. After the revolution, sigheh was encouraged by the state, and the public pulpit of Friday prayers became a platform from which clerics were able to encourage sigheh marriages. Sigheh was presented as a sawab, that is a heavenly reward, and a means to prevent social and sexual disorder. During and after the war, that is 1980s and 1990s, then President Hashemi Rafsanjani promoted sigheh as a means to solve the socioeconomic problems of young war widows. Most women for whom sigheh marriages were their best option at this time period were again from lower economic and social strata. Hence, sigheh marriages during and after the war were another factor in maintaining gender and class-based inequalities. During 2000s, many urban middle-class women, even though they abhorred sigheh, began to use the practice to their own advantage for reasons of social mobility or financial advancement. They became sigheh of men affiliated with the state who could provide them with a posh lifestyle. However, they kept these liaisons secret due to the social stigma attached to the custom, particularly for women. Now, in addition to using sigheh marriages to solve social problems associated with war widows, the Islamic Republic encouraged sigheh as a measure to circumvent social and sexual disorders. Some young men and women also started using sigheh to their advantage in the context of Western type of dating to avoid state restrictions enforced locally by the morality guards. At this time period, sigheh as trial marriage also became very common amongst the young men and women who wanted to get to know each other before they entered formal nikah marriage. And again, at this time, the state offered to open chastity houses, khaneh ifaf, for members of the Pasdaran, Basij, or war veterans where they could use sigheh with sex workers. However, this proposal faced much criticism and the bill never passed. During Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's presidency, 2005 to 2013, sigheh once again made headlines as Iran's solution to its social problems. For example, in 2007, Ahmadinejad's interior minister encouraged Iranian youth to enter sigheh marriages without their parents' knowledge. The public responded to this advice with much criticism and strong resistance. Ahmadinejad was forced to release a statement clarifying that the interior minister's offer should be viewed as a cleric's proposal rather than that of a state representative. Now, in 2007, the parliament also proposed several reforms to a number of important articles in the family protection law, including Article 22 of the bill, which proposed the removal of the requirement to register sigheh, which means removing women and children's financial and legal rights in sigheh marriages. Between 2008 and 2013, the bill was discussed several times. There were many protests and demonstrations by women's rights activists. However, in 2013, it was made law. According to this law, sigheh is registered only if the woman is pregnant, only if she asks for a registration at the very beginning, and if it's meant to turn into a nikah marriage. Now, for my book, I focused on cultural productions, even though I moved beyond cultural productions to analyze the entire institution within the context of history and culture. I focused on fictional works, 5 fictional works from the Pahlavi era, and then 2 cinematic works from the Islamic Republic. Now, in these works, which I analyzed, I realized that sigheh is used in various contexts with different connotations. For example, sigheh was used as a religious factor within pilgrimage zones and emphasizing clerics' exploitation of sigheh women. Sigheh was also used as in political and power relations, that is between sigheh women and property owners, landowners, landlords, police officers, and law enforcement. There were also sociocultural factors, for example, paralleling sigheh marriages with sex work, or portraying the abuse of children of temporary wives, or the mistreatment of temporary wives in public. One more thing was also temporary marriage or sigheh marriage as a means to save face and family honor. There were also a few works which focused on the advantages of sigheh marriages for women, but this was for certain women and very few, and it was for only widowed and divorced women. Now, the few literary works that exist under the Islamic Republic either focus on Arab sheikhs and sigheh, or the setting of the story was during the Pahlavi era, so they were not helpful for the purposes of my analysis. In the literature of Pahlavi era, as I mentioned, we have all these women who enter sigheh marriages out of financial necessities, saving family honor or face, while under the Islamic Republic, when we have all these factors we also have an additional factor, which is that of women who are not educated and independent, who enter sigheh for their own sexual needs, to explore their sexual desires, or because they just want to be mothers, even if it means single motherhood for them. In the context of my argument, I argue that each one of these works reflect the manner in which the practice of sigheh marriages, or the institution of sigheh, impacts women by calling into question how sexuality works as a form of political analysis and power. And my analysis examines the figure of sigheh woman as the sexual other in Iranian fiction and film. And because the bodies are the bedrock upon which societies stand, it was important for me to explore how and why women's bodies, including those of these sigheh women, engage with the state and society. It was also very critical to understand what constitutes a transgressing body and how are these transgressing bodies or non-normative bodies excluded, marginalized, or threatened. Let me read a passage from the book to clarify my argument. This is the book, by the way. While this book shows that the female body is an embodiment of sociocultural, political, and historical possibilities that are part of the regulatory discourse of the larger power structure, it also highlights the fact that the female body has agency, despite the fact that female characters are portrayed as invisible, liminal, vulnerable, and often stigmatized, especially in the case of sigheh women. They are simultaneously depicted as exercising a certain power by occupying a significant space in the social imaginary of the dominant Iranian culture. It is through this dual position that they disrupt the standard narratives about Iranian women and their sexuality, particularly in the context of sigheh. Sigheh women pose threats to the status quo, hold power over men, and create anxiety over male sexuality in Iranian society, even while they themselves are marginalized and subject to violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yaghoobi. Most interesting. Dr. Yaghoobi, your book has been described as impressive, as original, as timely, as robust, and also as an essential reading. To me, it is, of course, all of these and then some. It is an exceptionally well-researched and remarkably well-written book with insightful analysis of Persian texts, which are both old and new in cinema and in literature. And the subject matter is, of course, very interesting for anybody who's interested in, learning about sexuality and female subjectivity in Iran in general. But what sets your book apart from similar endeavors for me is how thorough and nuanced it is. And I would like to emphasize the word nuanced because, as Dr. Hari also points out, you show two sides of the same coin, and the coin being, temporary marriage. So as you yourself were just, talking about the fact that while they are marginalized, temporary wives are marginalized, they occupy center stage in the literary imagination, not just the literary imagination, the social imaginary of the patriarchal culture that exists in Iran. And so you show that they are subjugated, they lack agency, but you also show that they have social and they have symbolic power, right? And that's very interesting. I think that's a triumph of your book. And you shed light on the potential of the paradox that temporary wives embody. Well, so temporary wives, according to you, are not just victims, not merely victims, they're multifaceted, they're complex. On the one hand, they're judged, they're marginalized, they're stigmatized, and whatnot. And on the other hand, they are sought after, they're wanted. And they are victims, but as you said, they are also threats to the dominant order. And it is interesting how temporary wives can, consort with the most influential and affluent members of the society and then reintegrating to the society after the termination of their contract, and carrying with them all of the secrets that the punters or the husbands want to keep hidden. So we can see the kind of threat that they can pose. And it is this liminal space, or as you call it, this dual space, being a victim, being a scapegoat, but also being a threat, that I found most interesting. That's this dual space makes temporary wives such a potent, such a singular signifier. One other thing that I mentioned earlier was how thorough your book is. And I mean that because your book gives us a very comprehensive socio-historical survey of the time that these cultural productions belong to, showing us how female sexuality and how womanhood in general was defined and perceived by, across different periods that you talk about, across almost 100 years that you talk about and you cover in your book. And I don't think by delimiting your project to the study of sex work and to the study of temporary wives, you are actually narrowing the scope of your project. To me, what you're doing is actually, you're not only answering questions about how a particular subset of women were perceived and defined and how they were looking at themselves, their own self-perception, but how sex and sex work and marriage and womanhood in general have evolved throughout the years that your book covers. And one other thing that I found very interesting in your book is in analyzing your case studies, the 5 fictional works and also the cinematic works, you beautifully put Western feminist ideas and Iranian feminist ideas, Iranian feminists in conversation with one another. And the resultant is a comprehensive theory of embodiment, which speaks to the particular case of Iranian women. The case of the politicization of their bodies, their personal life, and to the state-sponsored corporealization of their bodies, and also to the state-sponsored and state-endorsed gender inequality, objectification, and violence. And your prologue is very memorable for me. From the very first pages, the book draws you in. You meticulously dissect the most recent case of sex espionage in Iran. The mayor of Tehran killing his temporary wife, and from the very first pages, you show us you underline the important themes that you want to focus in this book, the stigma that is attached to this practice of temporary marriage, the double standards that exist, treating men and women completely differently, and also the violence that is perpetrated on temporary wives in the name of temporary marriage, and also the unfair treatment that temporary wives, receive, and the gendered sociopolitical system that, these women can expect no helping hand from, no avenging hand from, even after they're murdered, right? So I found all of these very interesting, and I want to go on, but I don't think we have enough time for me to go on. And I want to stop here because I know everybody who's here wants to hear more from you. So I have a couple of questions that I would like to ask first, and then if we have, of course, we will have some time for the Q&A from the audience. So the members of the audience, please, if you have any questions, write in the Q&A section, and we'll definitely, ask them. And I would also like to recommend this book to everybody. So if you have not read this book, do yourself a favor and get a copy and read it. Dr. Yaghoobi, the subtitle of your book is Gender Politics in Modern Iran, Iranian Literature and Film. And I'm wondering why you chose literature and film as a lens to look at the Iranian society. Do you feel like the books that you have, or the fictional works that you have chosen, and the cinematic works that you have talked about in your work accurately represent the Iranian society?
Well, first, thank you, Mariam Jan, for this very beautiful and comprehensive critique of my work. To answer your question, of course, fictional works are fictional. We all know that. But in the absence of memoirs from, or biographies or autobiographies from sigheh women, your last resort is, cultural productions. And I had read the work by literary scholar Ali Asghar Sayyed Ghorab, which is called Modern Persian Prose and Fiction between 1900 and 1940. where he notes that in 20th century, the appropriation of Western modes of art, literature, and culture was a political project as well as a pedagogical one. Literature at this time was closely tied to a desire for political and social reform, as well as the construction of a modern Iranian nationalism, which was nevertheless presented as preserving the somewhat pure mother Iran. And then this reminded me of Professor Afsaneh Najmabadi's argument also, where she argues that Iranian modernity was tightly interlaced with notions of female nation, homeland, and mother Iran, whose purity and chastity was intertwined with concepts of male honor. So I'll read the exact quote that I have from Professor Najmabadi, and I'm quoting her. Iranian nationalism was formed around khak pak vatan, that is the pure soil of homeland, which reconfigured vatan from the earlier Perso-Islamic meanings as one's birthplace to a modern territorialized homeland imagined as the female body, end quote. So as modernity, modern fiction, and female body are intertwined in these nationalist discourses, and the way the political, sociocultural, and religious institutions define female sexuality and Iranian womanhood, I found that all of this was also reflected in the cultural productions of modern Iran. So that's how I ended up using cultural productions, but also because I'm a literary scholar and cultural studies scholar. So
Thank you very much. Makes sense. Would you also tell us about if you have faced any challenges when you were writing your book? Because I know that you could not go back to Iran, and you did not go back to Iran. Did you have any problem accessing the primary sources that you needed for this book?
That's a good question. All of us who work on, countries where we cannot return for our research face the same similar challenges. So part of this project was also conducted at the archives of the National Library of Iran during 2015 to 2017. But because I cannot return to Iran, I hired a research assistant to do the work for me, to collect the data and email them to me so I could analyze them. Other challenges that I faced were, the research that I got from the National Library in Iran did not return any substantive literary works during the Islamic Republic. So I had to opt out for the cinematic works, for example. Another challenge that I can think of, I was looking for works written or films directed by women. And again, except for brief references or, comedies, I couldn't find anything that took the topic of sigheh seriously. And finally, the challenge of translation that all of us face, the works that I analyzed, the works that I focused on are not translated. So I had to translate the passages that I have directly quoted in the book myself.
Well, thank you so much. And speaking of the difficulty of doing research in Iran, and writing about the hurdles that women actually face for, gaining their rights in Iran and their empowerment in Iran, I find it extremely frustrating myself, and at times even depressing, to read and constantly write about and, analyze the inhuman and unjust laws that we have in Iran, and how the regime penalizes any activity that might push the country in a more gender egalitarian direction. How do you cope with this frustrating situation, this most depressing situation? I'm very interested to know.
So I'm happy you're asking this question, because people who don't know what our research embodies cannot understand why we need so much time to recharge. Our task is a very taxing one. It involves a lot of emotional labor. But if I don't write, this is my idea. If I don't write the movements, women's works within Iran, the mobilizations will be forgotten. So in a way, I see my scholarship as my particular kind of activism that is not letting women's stories to be forgotten. It gives me hope that I am part of this larger community of scholars who are documenting these stories, who are doing the same work that is taxing, documenting the atrocities, documenting the movements, documenting this Iranian women's resilience and the work that they are doing in Iran that we are not able to do, but we can at least support them through documenting this for the future generations and put it in the history basically. So this is why I also try to keep my research relevant to the to today in Iran. Everything that is going on right now in Iran, I want to document those. And I also have a few interlocutors within Iran with whom I keep in touch to be on top of things. And then to cope with all of this that we all struggle, I mean, I have to take breaks of several months to be able to come back to another emotionally charged topic for research. And right now, I'm sure, as you know, we are working on, for all the participants, we are working on an edited volume on Iran's Me Too. So that's another, emotionally charged topic.
I, for one, am very grateful that you take responsibility for these emotionally charged, and labor-intensive, works and scholarship, because they're important. I firmly believe that they are very important and they're contributing to what is happening. I mean, the feminist scholarship that is happening inside Iran as well. And now I want to ask you a different question, because, well, these panels are supposed to talk about, Iranian authors in the diaspora and, how their consciousness, their double consciousness, and in your case, their triple consciousness, being Iranian, Armenian, and American. How does that inform your work? How does that set your work apart from, other writers who are writing in the diaspora?
Well, so as a member of, a diasporic minoritized population in Iran, and then now within the US, obviously I'm constantly negotiating this marginalized identity that embodies a space of liminality that also includes multiple consciousness in religious, ethnic, national, racial, cultural, gender, and sexual factors. It's not just my ethnic or religious identity. So this ambiguity and uncertainty of living in multiple cultures results in multiple identities and consciousnesses, which is a state of constant struggle, negotiation, and reconfiguration. And this liminal state of fluidity helps me to develop a resilience towards ambiguity and handling ambivalence within dealing with these various cultures. And embracing multiplicity helps me resist dualistic thinking within this diaspora, where I produce works which move beyond national boundaries. They become transnational. And however, they also simultaneously display my collective Iranian, Armenian, American, woman, person of color, woman of color characterization, which includes my flexibility, adaptability, and continuity. So yeah, I mean, dealing with ambiguity.
Okay, speaking of ambiguity and adaptability and all of that, I have a follow-up question for you, because I remember once you said that you, like a turtle, carry your home with you. And harking to back to Gloria Anzaldua's the statement about home. And for me, it is not possible. For me, I'm forever lamenting the bemoaning the loss of home and friendship and family and identity, right? And I wonder where home is for you and how can you carry it around?
Thanks for remembering that, quote and referencing Gloria Anzaldúa. One of my all-time favorite authors. Everybody should read Gloria Anzaldúa. I spent, I think 2 weeks reading all her works, but learning from her, my approach to homeland, nation states, and this mourning and nostalgia in this liminal space of diaspora became transnational, as I mentioned earlier. Of course, at the core of diaspora discourse and diasporic communities is the tension posed by the struggle to maintain heritage, culture, language, identity, while also you're trying to, construct this new identity and heritage via the exchanges with the host nation's culture. But to this end, I approach, these concepts with a flexible and fluid understanding. I remember also Edward Said talked about, when you are in diaspora or when you are in exile, you no longer are there is this contrapuntal thinking and multiple perspectives. So it's no longer duality, it's multiple.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for answering my question so thoroughly. And I think it's time we take a couple of questions from the audience as well. One of the questions that we received is, what are the differences between fictional and cinematic depictions of the notion of sigheh?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I briefly mentioned also in the talk, the main difference that I noticed from the Pahlavi era, where I analyzed the fictional works, to the cinematic works under the Islamic Republic, is this additional new type of woman that we have, the independent, educated, middle-class, urban woman who consciously, totally aware, wants to enter sigheh marriages. Now, this can be, again, for, exploring their sexual desires, their sexuality, for single motherhood, but that is the main difference. So in the cinematic works, for example, the 2 women in each film who enter sigheh marriages, they don't enter for socio-cultural or financial reasons. They enter because they want to explore other things.
Thank you very much. Now we have another question. So the writer says, I know that virginity is very important in Iran, mainly among most Muslims. So what would those women do after their temporary marriage is over? Will they remarry? Would they be explicit about their past, who they were and what they did?
So that's the reason why temporary marriage is mainly beneficial to divorced and widowed women. Because first of all, for, no father, this is the double standard. The fathers who might themselves contract sigheh marriages with other women will never agree for their daughters to enter sigheh marriages with other men, because of the stigma that is culturally and socially attached to this practice. And that after sigheh marriages, basically the woman particularly becomes marked.
Okay, thank you very much. And another question that we have is, could sigheh marriages be as short as weeks, a few months? What was the line between a socially recognized sigheh and an arrangement viewed as a cheap affair?
So sigheh marriages can last for an hour, a week, a day, a month, or 99 years. If they last for a month, a year, they can always be renewed. Now, the difference is in the registration of sigheh marriages. And that is, if the woman asks for it, they will be registered. The difference between the two, registered or non-registered sigheh marriages, there is no difference. Sigheh marriages for women come with stigma. So the women are stigmatized. And today in Iran, most of the, urban middle class educated communities view sigheh marriages as sex work.
Right. And do you think, it is my own question, do you think that the attitude is ever going to change towards sigheh marriage in Iran? Because as you said, now people are, young people are, contracting sigheh marriage for their own benefit. So it's not for the advantage of the government anymore. It's not like supervised by the government anymore in that sense, but it's something that they do because they want to explore different things. So do you think the stigma is ever going to go away? The double standard is going to go away?
I don't think the double standards and the stigma will ever go away. And I don't think the sigheh institution, the practice itself, will ever go away, because look at how long it has survived. And it has survived because it's beneficial to certain groups of people. And of course, in today's Iran, the more religiously affiliated communities really believe that sigheh marriages are like part of Savab. They do have the heavenly reward. So I don't think it will go away. I don't think the stigma within the more educated urban community will go away. But of course, the young people are manipulating it,
Right.
which is what I'm proud of, Iranian youth.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very interesting.
Ways, we are creative people.
We are. That's true. Okay, so we have another question, a very interesting question. So you mentioned women could have power in these marriages. What do you mean?
So I talked about the dual position that these sigheh women have in Iranian society. And by that, I mean the fear fascination that comes with these women. So why do men enter sigheh marriages? Because they are fascinated with these women. Because these women are not bound to, the formal marriage contract. They are free. They have this some kind of freedom, even though it is limited, but they do have a certain freedom. So they are fascinated with these women, but at the same time, because they pose threat to these men's, formal marriage and reputation in society, because of the stigma and everything that comes with it, they also fear them. So this position, this duality, gives these women a certain kind of sexual social power.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. And when you were talking about, we have more questions, so I'll keep my comment for now and ask some questions. So it was discussed earlier that temporary marriages show that women have a certain power in society, yet women are still oppressed in Iran. How can women leverage this power they have to give themselves a better standing in society?
Well, I mean, I just talked about the power that these women have in society in response to the previous question, but I also I really avoid saying that women in Iran are oppressed, because while women in Iran are oppressed, women in Iran also fight back. Women in Iran also resist. They find ways. I mean, look at the history from Qajar era, when women would wear, the chador of their maids to go outside of their homes to have, sexual liaisons, to refusing to marry to someone, finding different ways, to today where they are manipulating sigheh marriages and, attaining power by socially, walking up the social ladder, or engaging Western type of dating and using sigheh marriages to cheat on, basically deceive the government. So, I mean, there are so many ways that they occupy this powerful space.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you answered this question, but so do you think there is a way to negotiate religious beliefs? It seems like a dead end of conversation sometimes.
Well, I mean, if we are talking about religious beliefs in terms of sigheh, sigheh is not a religious institution. It was in the Arabian Peninsula even before, Islam came around. So it's more in scholarly discourses, it's referred to as more of a cultural institution. But today's government, Iran's government today, Islamic Republic, puts the religious facade on it. So I don't know how, they can go around those religious conversations that the government is trying to enforce, other than, using the same language that the government is using. Just like Audre Lorde's using the master's tools to burn the house down,
Right.
so, which is something they have been doing.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. We have an interesting question. So what would you do or write differently if you wanted to write this book again?
So this is our dear friend and colleague Elham Naich from Australia. Thank you for joining us, Elham. And I have to acknowledge everybody, the prologue where Mariam referred to, the concept of sexpionage came from Elham herself. And also writing the prologue, which was very timely because right at the time that the book was going into production, the Najafi thing happened, murder, and Mitra Ostad's murder. And Dr. Nair Tohidi suggested that I should add a prologue or something, I should include it. So I acknowledge I am in debt to my colleagues for all the comments they have provided me. But this is a good question. I have not given this much thought, Elhamjan. I'm sure by the time you're done with a piece of writing, you're done. You have to move to the next one. You don't want to think, what would you do differently? But I very much so wished I could find works by women, because I wanted to compare the representation of sigheh women by women and by men.
Right, and that's the same thing that you acknowledge in your own, epilogue. That's you were looking for them, and unfortunately.
Exactly.
Yeah. So another question is about what happens to the children born from or out of sigheh marriages?
So it depends on the father.
Mm-hmm.
If the father accepts paternity, the child gets a birth certificate, which is how children get birth certificate in Iran. If they don't have a male guardian or a father, women cannot get birth certificates for their children. So they have to have the father accept paternity. Most men do not accept. In the works that I analyzed, women got pregnant, men did not want to accept paternity, they murdered the women.
Right.
So it's basically eliminating both the unborn child and the female body that is posing threat.
Thank you very much. Another question, yeah, go ahead.
In real life, it's not always that tragic.
We can only hope that it's not that tragic for everybody who engages in temporary marriage. So another question is about white marriages. Are white marriages more acceptable among middle-class Iranians, comparing with sigheh marriages?
Among
middle-class Iranians.
Yes. So white marriages are, I don't want to say they are replacing sigheh marriages, because within the middle class, educated, more, kind of exposed to Western ideas and norms, within those communities, sigheh was also, from the very beginning abhorred, and they manipulated sigheh for their own purposes and their own advantage. Now they are doing the white marriage. And even back when I was in Iran 15 years ago, I had a student who was in a white marriage, for example. So I can't say that they are replacing, but that, white marriages are becoming more acceptable than sigheh marriages, because they belong, I feel like they belong to two different social classes. But of course, yes, white marriages are becoming very common today.
Okay, thank you very much, Claudia Jan. There's one more question, but I don't think we will have time for that question, unfortunately, because our time is up. And I would like to thank everybody for attending this panel. And Dr. Ziad, back to you.
Dr. Yaghoobi, Dr. Zehtavi, thank you very, very much for an absolutely fascinating and thought-provoking discussion. And of course, to all of those who attended. And Abdurrahman Sarsur, of course, for the technical side. We want to remind you that we have another panel coming up very, very soon, in just a few days, on Saturday, October 16th at noon. Do not miss it, with Umid Falahazad and our own Claudia Yaghoobi.
Thank you, everybody, for attending. See you on Saturday.
Thank you.